Yes, because it just wasn't right to the way they found the mother. And she would never leave that child.
When you pin on a badge, you make a sacred promise to protect and serve. But what happens when that badge becomes a shield for something far more sinister? In Charlotte County, Florida, a chilling truth lay hidden for over 4 decades, one that would shake the very foundation of trust between law enforcement and the community they swore to protect. 2 women dead in just 71 days. Both cases quickly went cold. But beneath the surface of these unsolved crimes lay a devastating connection that nobody wanted to believe. The person responding to these crimes was the same person committing them. For the families of Jackie Greer and Adele Easterly, justice seemed like a distant dream. Their loved ones were gone, their cases gathering dust in evidence lockers, while the person responsible continued to walk free. But secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of surfacing. And in Charlotte County, one deputy's dark past was about to come to light. This isn't just another story of a cold case solved. This is a tale of betrayal at its darkest, when the uniform meant to represent safety becomes a disguise for evil. This is the story of John Greer and how a small Florida community discovered that sometimes the monster isn't hiding from the police. Sometimes the monster is wearing the badge.
We know he murdered Adele. We know there are 2 other deaths in his life here.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. Charlotte County in the late 1970s was like many other Florida communities, a place where everybody knew everybody, where doors were left unlocked at night, and where the sight of a police cruiser brought comfort rather than fear. Nestled between Sarasota and Fort Myers, this peaceful coastal community was growing, but still maintained its small-town charm. The kind of place where people moved to escape the chaos of big cities, where they believed their families would be safe. It was in this setting that John Greer found his place in law enforcement. In 1979, he joined the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office as a deputy, a position that automatically granted him the community's trust and respect. To his colleagues, he seemed like any other officer, perhaps a bit quiet, but professional and capable. The badge he wore represented authority, protection, and justice. But for Greer, it would become something far more dangerous, a perfect cover. At home, Greer lived with his wife Jackie and their young son Bruce in a modest house on LaBelle Street in Port Charlotte. From the outside, they appeared to be the picture of a young law enforcement family. Dedicated father, loving mother, and their child. Jackie was known throughout the neighborhood for her kindness, particularly her devotion to their son. But beneath this seemingly normal facade, something darker was brewing. Greer's tenure at the sheriff's office would prove to be brief, lasting less than 2 years. During this time, he developed a reputation for inappropriate behavior that would later raise red flags. Yet, like many predators who hide behind positions of authority, his status as a law enforcement officer provided him with both access to victims and the knowledge to cover his tracks. What nobody realized at the time was that Charlotte County had unknowingly given power to someone who would abuse it in the most horrific way possible. In just a matter of months, 2 women's lives would be violently cut short, setting in motion a mystery that would take 4 decades to unravel. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on August 27th, 1979. Jackie Greer, just 25 years old, was found dead in her home on LaBelle Street. The official story, as reported by her husband, Deputy John Greer, was that she had taken her own life using his service revolver. The incident was quickly written off as a tragic suicide, another statistic in a growing ledger of lives lost too soon. But for those who knew Jackie, the story didn't add up. She was a devoted mother to her young son, Bruce, described by friends and family as someone who lit up every room she entered. Jackie would have never left her son. Teresa Good, a family acquaintance, would later recall, "She lived for that boy." The thought of her abandoning her child through suicide seemed impossible to those closest to her. The investigation, if you could call it that, was suspiciously brief. Perhaps it was Greer's position as a deputy that prevented deeper scrutiny, or maybe it was simply the limitations of 1970s forensic capabilities. Whatever the reason, Jackie's death was quickly ruled a suicide. The case file closed before the ink had dried on the report. Greer maintained custody of their son Bruce, and life in Charlotte County continued, but the shadow of Jackie's death would linger, an unspoken question mark in the minds of those who knew her. In a cruel twist of irony, the very man tasked with investigating suspicious deaths had managed to avoid any real investigation into his own wife's passing. Just 71 days later, death would visit Charlotte County again, and once more John Greer would be at the center of it all. But this time, the circumstances would be impossible to ignore, though it would take decades for the true connection to emerge. On October 6th, 1979, Adelaide Adele Easterly was working what should have been a routine shift at the farm store on Highway 17. At just 25 years old, she was known among regular customers for her friendly demeanor and warm smile. The convenience store was a community hub where locals would stop for groceries, gas, and casual conversation. That autumn evening, it would become the scene of a brutal murder. The call came in from Deputy John Greer himself. He had discovered Adele's body inside the store, and what he found was horrific. She had been shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun, once in the head and once in the back. The violence of the attack shocked the small community, transforming their quiet town into a place where mothers started locking their doors and watching their daughters more closely. At first glance, Greer's presence at the scene seemed like a coincidence. Just another deputy responding to a tragic situation. But, as investigators would later discover, his connection to Adele ran deeper. Witnesses would eventually reveal that Greer had developed an unsettling interest in the young store clerk, his behavior described by some as controlling and obsessive.
So I'd met him and I'd talked to him a time or two, and he was creepy. So my guess is that she started feeling the creeps too.
The murder weapon was never found, and despite the brutality of the crime, leads quickly ran cold. Perhaps most disturbing was how Greer, the responding officer, had inserted himself into the investigation. His knowledge of police procedures allowed him to stay one step ahead, manipulating the evidence collection process in ways that wouldn't be understood until decades later. The deaths of Jackie Greer and Adele Easterly, separated by just 71 days, had more in common than anyone realized at the time. Both victims were young women in their mid-20s. Both had connections to John Greer, and both cases would remain unresolved for over 40 years, their files gathering dust while their killer continued to walk free, protected by the very badge he had sworn to honor. As shocking as Adele's murder was, the investigation quickly hit a wall of silence. Law enforcement in the 1970s lacked many of the forensic tools we take for granted today. There was no DNA analysis, no advanced ballistics testing, no cell phone records to trace.
You got a lot more resources today. You have a lot more like DNA. You have a lot more things you can try to do. Cell phones, social media tracking, you have all that, and they didn't have that back then.
But perhaps more significantly, there was an unspoken reluctance to look too closely at one of their own. The case grew cold almost immediately. Greer's position as a deputy created a unique challenge. He knew exactly how investigations worked, what evidence would be looked for, and more importantly, what to avoid leaving behind. His knowledge of police procedures wasn't just convenient, it was a shield that helped him stay one step ahead of his colleagues. By 1980, less than a year after Adele's murder, Greer's behavior at the sheriff's office had become problematic enough to warrant suspension. Rather than face an investigation into his conduct, he resigned. But this wasn't the end of his law enforcement career. In a move that would later prove horrifying, Greer managed to secure positions with several other Florida agencies, including the Punta Gorda Police Department. The years ticked by, and the files on both Jackie Greer and Adele Easterly gathered dust. Families were left without answers, and the community's trust in law enforcement began to erode. Those who knew Jackie continued to question the suicide ruling, while Adele's family waited for justice that seemed would never come. The most chilling aspect of the stalled investigation wasn't just that a killer walked free, it was that he continued to wear a badge, carrying the authority and power that came with it. Witnesses who might have come forward were silenced by fear. After all, who would believe accusations against a law enforcement officer? And more importantly, who would protect them if they spoke up? After decades of silence, the walls around John Greer's secrets began to crumble. In 2016, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a woman who had carried her own traumatic story for nearly 40 years. She had been a teenager in the Sheriff's Explorer program when Greer was a deputy, and what she revealed would finally set the wheels of justice in motion. Her testimony was devastating. She described how Greer had repeatedly raped her, using his position of authority to manipulate and silence her. But it was what he said during these assaults that would send chills through the investigation team. According to her statement, Greer had threatened her with a chilling warning. Ask them dead expletives like Adele Easterly what happens when they say no to me. This brutal confession, casually dropped as a threat, would become the key to unlocking decades of silence. Detective Mike Gandy of the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office took charge of the reopened investigation. The task before him was daunting, piecing together evidence from crimes committed nearly 40 years earlier, with many witnesses either deceased or memories faded by time. Yet, as investigators began digging deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Greer's time in law enforcement had left a trail of suspicious deaths and terrified victims. His knowledge of police procedures had allowed him to stay ahead of investigations. But now, with modern investigative techniques and a fresh perspective, the truth was finally coming to light. The investigation team meticulously reconstructed the events of 1979. They re-interviewed surviving witnesses who were now more willing to speak about Greer's controlling behavior and obsessive tendencies. The picture that emerged was of a predator who had used his badge not just as a cover, but as a weapon to inspire fear and ensure silence. The breakthrough in 2016 didn't just reopen old cases, it validated what many had suspected for decades. John Greer, the man sworn to protect and serve, had been hiding in plain sight, his crimes concealed behind a badge that represented justice. In April 2024, investigators made their way to a nursing home in Kingsport, Tennessee. There, they found John Greer, no longer the imposing figure who had once stalked the streets of Charlotte County with a badge, but a frail 77-year-old man confined to his bed. As death approached, the man who had evaded justice for over 4 decades finally decided to speak. The confession, when it came, was as chilling as it was matter-of-fact. Without a trace of remorse, Greer admitted to killing both his wife, Jackie, and Adele Easterly.
When they talked about Adele, when they talked about Jackie, he acknowledged that he was involved in their shootings.
The carefully constructed lie about Jackie's suicide crumbled as he described an argument over his service revolver that ended in murder. The story he had maintained for 45 years, that his wife had taken her own life, was finally exposed as the calculated deception it had always been. When it came to Adele Easterly, Greer confirmed what investigators had long suspected. He had killed her with a 12-gauge shotgun, the same type of weapon that had been used in the farm store murder. The man who had called in her death was the same one who had orchestrated it, using his position as a responding officer to manipulate the crime scene and steer suspicion away from himself. Detective Gandy and his team had finally gotten their confession.
He was very bold with women. I got a feeling he wasn't that bold with men. I think he was probably a wuss.
But the victory was bittersweet. Greer's admissions came not from remorse or a desire for redemption, but from the knowledge that he was beyond the reach of earthly justice. His deteriorating health meant he would never face a jury, never have to look into the eyes of his victims' families, never have to answer for the lives he had destroyed. Just weeks after his confession, in March 2024, John Greer died in that same nursing home. He escaped the justice system one final time, leaving behind a legacy of pain and unanswered questions. Investigators believe there may be more victims, more lives destroyed by a man who used his badge as a license to kill. For the families of Jackie Greer and Adele Easterly, Greer's confession brought a complicated mix of closure and renewed pain. While they finally had confirmation of what many had suspected for decades, the bitter reality remained. John Greer had lived free for 45 years, while his victims lay in their graves. The Charlotte County Sheriff's Office continues to investigate the possibility of other victims.
I think we're going to have some multi-state coverage on this. From the time that he died, we started putting out some information to other agencies between here and Kingsport, Tennessee.
Detective Gandy and his team believe that the deaths of Jackie and Adele may represent only a fraction of Greer's crimes. His pattern of predatory behavior, combined with his various positions in law enforcement across Florida, suggests there could be more victims whose stories remain untold. The chilling legacy of John Greer serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't hiding in the shadows. They're hiding behind badges, using positions of authority to commit their crimes and conceal their tracks. His case has forced law enforcement agencies across the country to confront uncomfortable questions about oversight and accountability within their ranks. What do you think? How many other John Greers might be out there using their positions of power to prey on the vulnerable? How many cold cases might have similar dark connections to those sworn to protect and serve? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more true crime stories like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding in plain sight.